So Gabe and Mark and I are here, and we're going to start talking about the mental obsession and addiction and sobriety and life and love and the full range. I would hope we would explore at some point during today's talk. Mark sent me a quote from Albert Einstein that I think is worthy of note and ties into what we discuss. Starts with electromagnetic fields are not of the mind. Creation may be spiritual in origin, but that does not mean that everything created is spiritual. How can I explain such things to you? Let us accept the world as a mystery. Nature is neither solely material nor entirely spiritual. Man, too, is more than flesh and blood. Otherwise, no religions would have been possible. Behind each cause is still another cause. The end or the beginning of all causes has yet to be found. Yet only one thing must be remembered. There is no effect without a cause, and there is no lawlessness in creation. And that was from a book, as mentioned in Einstein and the Poet, 1983. So that must have been a quote by somebody. So that's interesting. So what would it be that might be created that isn't spiritual? If you were to go out on a limb.
I don't know. Is hydrogen spiritual?
I would say the elements are spiritual because they're elementary, and in the essential aspect of our discussion, that would be inherent. Like anything essential would be certainly not something that's optional or not something that is negotiable. But I would suggest lies and the consequences of them are not spiritual based. Their fantasy is reality, so they don't function in the same terms of the laws of nature. They function in the absolute opposite terms, where they become destructive forces, and we have maligned our thinking about them as something happening to us, rather than realizing that humanity, as far as I can tell, at least on this planet, are the only ones that lie. Animals don't lie. Animals aren't conniving and trying to be something they're not and trying to steal everything from everyone else. They're simply doing their best to eat and sleep and rest and procreate and maintain their species in whatever possible way that is. And a lot of the thinking we've done has inhibited nature's capacity. And I'm not saying we're responsible for it all and we're the only thing that's wrong on the planet, because there's certainly confluences of nature that are incredibly destructive or seemingly destructive, that in essence that destruction tends to create more abundance. So in the natural process of things, those things only seem catastrophic to us because they get in the way of our thoughts and our ideas. But if we have done anything that has created a contaminant that is impossible for another creature to absorb or benefit from, we have been responsible directly in the same kind of thinking that kills us or minimizes our potential to live in the capacity that we're capable of, in the exact same way. Whatever we are leaving as a trace element of what we have done that is wrong, toxic waste, whatever it is, nuclear waste, whatever it is having an impact on nature. And it's coming from and resulting from not spirituality, but the idea that I can create my own reality, which isn't spirituality at all, because it isn't based in the laws of nature. It's based in the idea that I am the creator of reality, because my thoughts are real, my thoughts are true, and the only thing I can do, and because I think they're true, they're right, which pits me against every other wrong out there. It doesn't pit me against right because it doesn't have any effect on what's right.
Yesterday I was talking with somebody, and they obviously heard something much different than I had asked. And I so related with that person. I simply asked, he had relapsed in gambling.
Mhm.
And I asked him what his strategy was this time going in. Like, what was your strategy for gambling? And that is not what he heard.
Right.
And that was not his answers to me. And he went on about how I was attacking him and this and this. And he was giving me all this information. And I told him, like, you're giving me a lot of information I didn't even ask you. Not, I just asked you what your strategy was, and I so related, and that was the lie. Like the brain transformed it into a lie or something. Like something happened there, from what
Well,
I heard, what he heard.
obsessive thoughts listen to what they think is being said because they're so desperate and so protective that anything other than what the person thinks, because they think their thinking is true, is going to threaten that premise. So they only hear what they think is being said, which means they're not hearing what is being said.
Yeah. So what you were just talking about really related to that for me.
Isn't it weird in Gamblers Anonymous that, in AA and the other drug, it says we became willing to go to any lengths. And the any lengths is really going all in. So for a gambler, that's like putting up everything you got. Right.
Yeah.
And yet
Well,
if you're putting everything you got up into something that doesn't have any odds, that's an absolute winner, there's no risk in it, which is what sobriety is about. It's starting to see that if we're basing the basis of our thinking in something that's actually real, not fantasy, not culture, not a delusion thought to be real, fantasy thought to be real, but actual reality, and realize that if this exists, as Einstein's saying, that lawlessness doesn't exist in the lawful nature of existence.
and I think that's where I was trying to get with him, was because I had gotten to the point where I realized I didn't have any reservations. And once I didn't have any reservations, I haven't had an urge.
Mm-hmm.
In all of the badness and sadness and upsetness and less than and insecurities and everything that used to drive me out, like I don't know. It just never, it's like the option left.
Well, it
And I was
isn't that
trying to
the
get him
option
to,
left. You're not choosing the option anymore. You're free to notice. You have absolutely no obligation. And the idea of choosing that becomes obviously insane, rather than thought of as the only thing you can do. And that's really the transition of addiction, is thinking, I have to fight it. I have to not do it. I can't do it anymore. When in fact, we're absolutely free to do it. And to come to terms with that is to see what neutrality is, which is in the big book 84 and 85. Taken to a place of neutrality. It says it's as though it happened to us, for us, something to that degree. Seeing that it's the basis of this freedom. It isn't a position one way or another. It's not good or bad. It's the absolute center point that isn't either. And yet it's both. So the irony, just like the paradoxes, becomes the actual awareness of reality and truth, rather than seeing it as a divisive opposition to one thought or another. Do you hear that?
yes, yes.
Yeah. So as you start noticing what you noticed, Mark, about people not answering the question, you're going to start to notice that most of the questions you ask, people don't answer.
Mm.
That there's an immediate suspicion that you found them out on some point, and they need to cover up quickly. So they come back to you in a direction that doesn't have anything to do with what you're asking. So think about intimacy, and then think about that divergent choice to act that way. which is reactive. Reactivity isn't a natural response. It's a defensive, automated, chronic. It's what addiction is, where it seems to be the only thing we can do. So we resign ourselves to thinking it's the only thing we could do. It's that just doing that is all we can do, literally. Now, think of that, that means no choice. And if choice always includes the choice not to be chosen, if you think of it principally, just like good is always based on bad. If something's good, it's not bad. If it's bad, it's not good. The two are intimately connected. They're not apart from one another. So if I think I always need to be good, or it's always going to be good, and I'm always seeking to be good, I'm denying the fact that I'm fluid, that I'm literally, it's like I'm living at the sea while I'm standing on earth. I'm moving and fluid. All of these experiences are around us, these picturesque opportunities to witness that. The way that the flowers in the field move with the wind is the same way the ocean moves. And the wind tends to be what whips up the swells. And so our emotions are moving, they're motionless. And my sense is I get seasick on earth when I get nauseous, when I get nervous, I feel like I'm seasick, literally, and I'm spinning out, I say. Mm-hmm. So I'm in a whirlwind, or like a tornado in water, which is what do they call them? Kind of like the way a toilet flushes. It just creates that swirl, and there's a thing in nature that does that. Yeah.
Whirlpool.
Whirlpool, yeah. And it feels like that when I'm in my head, swirling and I'm trying to stop what I keep starting, and I wonder what it is that keeps going on, and I'm creating this whole hailstorm, literally. I think they call it hailstrom. They misspelled it. Or maelstrom. Creating this whole experience, trying to justify something that makes absolutely no sense, because I'm the creator of the mess, and I'm the opposer of that mess at the same time. So the one thing I can create is a mess, because a mess doesn't occur in that lawful nature of nature, like Einstein's saying. There's no lawlessness in that nature, in that essence. So to his point, we don't need to understand it to come to terms with the fact that we are byproducts of it. And whatever it is right now, and always has been and always will be. And if that becomes the basis of my thinking starts to actually express that knowingness, rather than constantly think it needs to get to it as though it isn't there now. If I'm lying about my present, I'm setting up an idea that I don't belong, because I need to be somewhere else with something else and someone else in some greater or lesser way. And it's all coming out of the idea that my thoughts are real, and if I'm not thinking about what's happening, I'm not here. Mm-hmm. When in fact, I'm always here, very often thinking about what isn't happening, what I wish was happening, what I hoped was happening, what I thought should be happening, all of those things.
Which brought me to, again, that quote this morning, which was wonderful, about there is no lawlessness in creation, which really finally gave me, I think, a definition of the nature of nature that I'd been searching for. But it also made me stop and recognize your question that you had asked me about how is my body this morning? Because I've been fighting an illness, a physical illness. And after contemplating it, like I wrote you, I was like, it hit me like, thank God my body is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. It's sending white blood cells to the areas that are infected. It's not thinking about it. It's just doing it. There's no lawlessness there. Like, yes. There was no thought. There was no. It was perfect. It was beautiful. It was honest. It was.
So if that's our nature, you're talking about healing,
right?
What would be unnatural that would diminish that capacity?
A cancer cell or a cancerous thought.
Good. So a cancerous thought would be something I'm doing, not something that's happening on its own. It's something I'm having. So if I have a thoughtless thought and think that it's substantive, it's exactly what cancer is. It's trying to make sense of its own isolation by creating more and more and more of the cancer cells to think that it's in harmony with the neighborhood, which is what insanity is.
Right.
It's thinking the more I think about my obsessive thinking that have no basis in reality, the closer I'm going to get to reality and finally figure it out and finally get there. So what am I doing? Always trying to get somewhere that doesn't exist because it doesn't exist now. It's not the place I'm getting that doesn't exist. It's the presence of my thinking now that has no basis, that doesn't exist in real existence. Doesn't mean I'm not thinking it. Doesn't mean I don't have an illusion about it that I think is real, which is worth noting because it begins to help me see anyhow that I'm creating a dream that I'm making believe is real. And when I do that, I think I'm in it. And as a result, I have no perspective whatsoever but to think that is all of reality. I'm consumed and intoxicated by this event I've created, which is absolutely a delusion, triggering all kinds of bodily chemicals. And guess what happens through that anxiety and stress? All that natural functional capacity to heal begins to get undermined in my body because I've introduced this toxic idea that causes stress and anxiety and pressure. And if you look at every disease defined, they all say to some degree, anxiety and stress needs to be reduced. Over and over and over and over again. Why? Because it causes, if something is out of control that's sick, it will become more out of control the sicker we maintain it, because I'm undermining my body's capacity. Why is it that we talk about reducing stress and try to think of it as things we can do about it and not ask what it is we're doing to cause it? We don't think we're responsible for it because historically we've thought this is just human nature. It isn't nature to act unnaturally and call it nature. That's a collision course. It's natural to think the way you just did, where you said, thank God, or whatever the source is, that this works this way. That's amazing. It's actually doing what it's doing to get me healthier. Now, the question is, am I facilitating that health or am I actually denaturing it? Am I doing something that's abnormal as normal, that's unhealthy, that I think is healthy, by continuing to create this onslaught of present traumatic stress in this thought that I don't belong, I don't have any place, and I'm not part of reality? And that's exactly the outcome of these thinking about thoughts that have no basis. They have no denominator, and we're making believe the bigger the numerator gets, the bigger the number. But the only way that's even possible is at least there's got to be a 1 in the denominator rather than a 0. At least it then matches the numerator. But when there's nothing there, there's nothing on top. So the greatest substance abuse is the idea that a thought that has no basis is substantive. And that creates present traumatic stress because we make believe our life depends on maintaining that sick idea at all costs. And that reactivity is what you're hearing people often respond to your questions on.
I like that, present traumatic stress. I don't know if I've ever heard that before.
Well, if we're always present and everything that's happening is present, it can't be past, it can't be post. And one of the causes of continuing to maintain it is think it happened somewhere in the past rather than it's being maintained now by thinking it isn't here. How much more traumatic stress could you add than making believe the thing you're trying to heal isn't even possible to get to? It's just another form of impossibility thought of incorrectly in the present. So we treat the symptom, trying to feel better about it, trying to get over it, rather than say, why not just look at the cause? What does Einstein say? There's no effect without a cause, no effect, which we've talked about. Cause and effect are immediate, but the effect never comes without a cause. The effect never causes the cause. The effect can become a cause because now it becomes a trigger for that chain reaction that's going on where the effect, the cause, the effect, the cause, the effect, it just goes on and on and on. But when the effect becomes the cause, again, the cause is still the cause. So if the effect is, I'm afraid, I feel like a moron, I'm an idiot, and all those kind of thoughts, what I need to do is start looking like I'm not an idiot, and I'm not afraid, and I'm not a moron. When I continue, that's a moronic thought, idiotic thought, because now I'm basing everything on appearance, which is all that how things seem to be is about. How things seem is not how they are. How they appear is not how they are. Something that's substantive, we know, because there's no escape from that. And there's no letting go of that. And there's no getting over that because it has us. We don't have it until I align my thinking with it and say, oh, that's all they've ever had. And it's everything. It's all of it. We're a part of it all. We're not some small part of it all. If we're part of it all, we're part of the whole. And the only part I have is what I choose to think. That's the freedom I have. I've been given by that nature to say, do whatever you want. Whatever you want, you can do. So whatever I'm doing is what I want now. And it's hard to come to terms with that, to say, wow, do I really want things the way they are? My question would be, how else, what other way can they be than the way they are? If they're how they are now, they're how they are. If I can't argue with that, except in ways that would begin to suggest it isn't happening or shouldn't be happening, think of that collision course in terms of trauma. Everything that's happening shouldn't be happening. That's a major problem. That's a major stressor. Like, oh boy, I got to get busy to stop everything from happening. I got to go into a real deep mind bend to make believe that that's even possible. Think of the degradation and the isolation and the complete. It's like being buried in a box 6 feet underground and nobody knows you're there. It's horrifying. And then we try to get over it and feel better about it while we're doing this dance as though it's not happening. And you can read it. You can see it. You can see the nervousness. You said it to me when we first met. You asked me that. Do I seem nervous? I also, the first time I ever saw you, I saw your posture and I knew you were a candidate. You were applying for the job. I mean, your shoulders were slumped, your head was drooped. You could see the weight sort of trying to get you back into that embryonic position so you could find a womb somewhere to retire to.
I think I was in tears within 15 seconds of meeting you.
Yeah. Well, I think you were there. You just hadn't let the ice melt.
Yeah.
Good morning, Harry. Good morning, Arliss.
Good morning.
Hey, Mark, would you reread for Harry and Arliss since they're walking in a little bit late? There's that Einstein quote. There's one quote in there. There's one sentence in there that was repeated. I don't know if you noticed that, but whoever transcribed that repeated it. And the second sentence is whole and the first one gets cut off and then starts over.
I'm just going to read the whole thing. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Albert Einstein explains the nature of nature. Electromagnetic fields are not of the mind. Creation may be spiritual in origin, but that doesn't mean that everything created is spiritual. How can I explain such things to you? Let us accept the world as, or let us accept the world as a mystery. Nature is neither solely material nor entirely spiritual. Man, too, is more than flesh and blood. Otherwise, no religions would have been possible. Behind each cause is still another cause. The beginning of all causes, has yet to be found. Behind each cause is still another cause. The end of the beginning of all causes has yet to be found. Yet only one thing must be remembered. There is no effect without a cause, and there is no lawlessness in creation.
So I will suggest in looking at this, one of the first things he says is electromagnetic fields are not of the mind. So he's thinking of it distinct. The relative material world is distinct from a mind, and I would capitalize, this guy's got it lowercase, I would capitalize mind in that regard to start to say this is the all-knowing, omniscient, ever-present, absolute, unlimited, omnipotent, omnipresent, all-powerful source, whatever it is. We don't have to even describe it any further than just to say it's everything, and it doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have an end, it's not in time, it's just some element that seems impossible to even fathom. And he was talking about that because Einstein said that the further he looked at things, the more he seemed to be looking into the face of God, defining that element that seemed to be so extraordinarily beautifully elegant in its observation, that he was witnessing it as he looked deeper into the physics that he was studying. So we think of mind as capital and think of that as the essence, behind the essence, behind these seemingly levels that we're dealing with, these seeming levels that we're dealing with. It starts to line up with what Bill talks about in terms of absolute, unlimited, omnipotent, ever-present, all-powerful, infinite source, meaning no options. So we're dealing with something that has no options. It isn't an option for us, and it's not negotiable for us. That's the nature of nature, as Einstein is saying in the beginning of that quote. He's explaining the nature of nature. So if what comes out of that for us is thinking and choices to think, that's a freedom we have to think. The right we have to think does not make our thinking right. And historically, humans have been at odds with one another, fighting over what they think. What one person thinks is right becomes an enemy in their mind, in their brain, in terms of what another person thinks. And we're witnessing it today. This sort of crushing defeat that humans seem to consistently need to follow, where empires greater than any that exist today in terms of size collapsed under the weight of the thinking, their idealistic thinking. And almost every one of those societies captured the enemy. When they captured the enemy, turned them into slaves to continue to build the greatness of their empire. And you can see the weakness in the thinking of making believe that an empire becomes great by enslaving people. It's a vulnerability that's trying to outrun and outpace the vulnerability by making believe that more and more effort at a material level and having more and looking bigger is somehow going to satisfy the underlying vulnerability and weakness of that thinking. So I'm no Einstein, but Albert was. And he is literally a textbook example of somebody who looked at these things and was also given great credit for what he did and was also humble enough to say, I'm still looking. I'm still seeing. I'm still willing. He didn't become the end all. He became the beginning point to look further, to think more, to open up to that vastness. And the idea of the cause always being there is the idea that if we're treating effects in addiction, the whole point of being an addict is to try to solve the problem with the problem. So for an alcoholic, it's drink more. For a gambler, it's gamble more. For a sexaholic, it's more sex. Not just sex in a procreative, healthy, intimate way, but risky sex. Sex for the sake of sex. Food for the sake of food that isn't healthy, it isn't nutrition based, it's just food. We're giving our body something and our body says, thanks for the food, but now give me some nutrition. It keeps asking for more and it gets more bad food. That's the addiction. The idea that we're not even responsible for it is the blindness of it. The idea that our eye can't see itself, but we know when we open our eyes, we can see. And in that same way, in this discussion, we absolutely can see the effects we're creating, which tells me there's a cause underlying those effects that I may not be dealing with that well. And I don't think socially we've dealt with well throughout history to be still treating the effects as a solution. We treat symptoms very often in medicine and don't say, what is the cause of this mental anxiety? What is the cause of this mental stress? And what greater cause could it be than to think our thinking was reality and then feel completely disconnected and alone, always trying to feel like we need to belong to some degree, to find some place that never seems to be found, to have something in greater and greater amounts that's never enough. When enough is never enough, reason and understanding and words completely fall apart. They have no purpose whatsoever. And language is unique to us in terms of a species, even though all the other animals speak. It's not quite as advanced as ours to be able to look at things like life and consider and ponder things. And addiction is taking that great capacity, that great contemplative advantage, and turning it completely against our own natural instincts, which is to survive by becoming the major threat within, as though we're not doing it. I'm creating an enemy inside that I make believe. We talk about the ego as some distinct part of us that's apart from us very often. Oh, my ego got the best of me. We think of it as though it's not our choices being made. So we can discount it and just say, well, there's nothing I can do. I got to continue. Arliss, nice to see you. You
Nice
must have
to
been
see you.
very,
Yeah.
you must have been busy for a while.
Yeah, pretty busy. Had
Good.
a couple of grandkids come along, new ones.
Wow.
Yeah, so we've been moving around and adjusting and all that kind of thing.
It's an amazing thing to witness, especially when you're one generation beyond the parenting.
Yeah, I think the lack of immediate concern in the sense of being responsible and whatever that might mean on any given day is kind of removed. And so you have a kind of looseness in how you're, and an objectivity in how you're encountering these people. And it's been really lovely for me to see, some things I've been reading about kind of happen right in front of my eyes in terms of human development, how we develop beliefs, how we develop programs for what we imagine to be happiness and things like this. And my kids are really great about not interfering with their kids. So if one of them does something that another parent might say, no, no, we don't do that. They, particularly when the kid can't talk yet, doesn't have a way to explain what's happening. My kids are much more interested in what's happening with the kid than they are a stain on the floor or a slowdown in the way they want to go through the day. They just seem to be very, very interested in this little creature, which in turn lets them become, nobody's fucking with them, trying to make them be somebody they're not.
Yeah.
That's fun to watch.
In the Hebrew tradition, the especially in the Orthodox tradition, they don't do any kind of direction for the first 5 years. So it's a complete free-for-all. And I knew a guy in Los Angeles, Shlomo Schwartz was his name, a rabbi, like the perfect name for a rabbi, and had 12 or 13 kids. And I went over for a meeting at his house, and it was absolute mayhem.
Yeah.
The older kids were they were playing with the younger kids. They were just like playing cowboys and Indian. I mean, it was just amazing. And he paid attention as though nothing was happening.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
I think it is literally, in my experience, impossible for a 2-year-old to make it hard for you. They just get in the way of what you may think you need to be doing from time to time. But the idea of these kids is some kind of burden. And then you have the question, like, somebody hold a gun to your head, and this is the thing people could forget very quickly under the pressure of lack of sleep or whatever, is nobody's running around yet anyway, forcing anybody to have children,
I think
but
ultimately it's the lack of control.
yeah, I think that probably, that's probably the most universal human characteristic, isn't it? The
Well,
illusion.
especially when it comes to sex.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, we should stop now because we may end up with an unintended consequence. But I think what you're saying, Arliss, that I'm hearing is that nature of making believe our thinking is real has us make believe we need to impose that on other people. And it's never been true, but it's always been conveniently thought of as something we have to do, and ends up being a very insistent irritant in the process of allowing people, because when you see a baby, they're all intact. I mean, they got the nails and they got the eyes and they're breathing, and they just lived 9 months without breathing, which is pretty interesting. We think of breathing as essential to life. They just went 9 months without it breathing and are in perfect condition for the most part.
Yeah, I think that thing about ultimately imposing one's belief on somebody else comes from a certain insecurity that seems to elude. I find this, funnily enough, most true in a lot of what would like to call themselves spiritual traditions. The idea of knowing God to the point that you can force someone else to believe the way you do or encounter it the way you do, or these contradictions in what we call spirituality are just proof one more time about our desire to control and the illusion that we have of managing our life to the degree that we can develop really rigid systems for that.
Yeah, and that chronic defensive-ness is the rigidity. I read a Herbert Spencer quote this past week that said, "The tyrant is a slave turned inside out."
Yeah, that's a good one.
And something, I was talking to Santiago at one point, and it occurred to me that humanizing God has been the nature of dispiriting humans.
Mhm.
This idea that God becomes a man and he's in the clouds, he's always somewhere else, he's never here. It's like Santa Claus. You never see him, but he seems to visit everyone occasionally, and he doesn't give them gifts if they don't behave. They get coal.
Yeah.
And it becomes a hateful, spiteful version of ego as God. So I'm worshiping my ego in the name of thinking someday I'll get my thinking right because I think it's a source of reality, when in fact what I'm creating is more and more contempt and feeling more and more condemned. Deeper and deeper and deeper, further apart. And historically, we've done that excellent. We've given ourselves so much experience at that, and look at it as being part of human nature, when in fact it's abnormal and unnatural. It isn't human nature at all. It's the nature of a disconnected idea being the source of reality.
Yeah.
The ultimate substance abuse and mental addiction is the idea that no substance is reality. Something we talked about it before you came on, but having a fraction with zero as the denominator means it doesn't matter how much we put on top, it continues to be zero. We can have it look like it's big and appear like it's big and act like it's big and think it's big and claim it's big and insist it's big, but it's zero, nothing, absolutely nothing. Doesn't even exist. It's not even low self-esteem at that point. It's no self-esteem, because there's nothing in existence whatsoever that is esteemable in that regard. And I would say that's been a historic, as long as humans have been have used self-indignation to enslave, oppress, suppress, and kill other people in the name of a thought, we've been thinking this way and not thinking we were thinking that way. It's a major collision course.
That's interesting. I was thinking about this very thing, the notion of self, which in the more and more I'm reading these days, and the more and more questions I'm asking, it seems like that there's a real opinion gathering about the idea of a self as a construct, and very difficult to prove as a phenomenon. And so, with that said, I had an Uncle James who is kind of a folk hero in our family, who I remember when I was a kid in a hunting camp, he didn't finish high school. He went on the road as a salesman when he was a kid, ended up working for Jim Dandy dog food. And he had bird dogs and what have you. And he was just one of those guys who was always there. Like you would hear people say, well, the roof of our barn came in, and next day we had a crew and James brought over these people, or there'd be a funeral, tragic early death, and he'd be kind of lurking in the background. He was just always there. And my cousin Buzz, who was a real thinker, liked to tease him because Buzz had a doctorate and he was the curator of the Birmingham Zoo at the time when I was a kid. And he would always say to James in the hunting camp, he'd say, Daddy, I just read an article in the New York Times about self-esteem. And my Uncle James would go, oh, here we go. Here we go. And he said, what's self-esteem? What do you mean? And he goes, well, it's the way you feel about yourself, whether you feel good about yourself or bad about yourself. And I remember James looking over across the fire at him and saying, well, hang on a second. Who's feeling what about who? He had no concept that you could feel a certain way about yourself or not. It didn't make sense to him. And some people would say, well, he didn't regard himself, that the life of service is, but actually, particularly if you read Marcus Aurelius, when he says that great quote about be a human being, go about being a human being the way a bird goes about being a bird. What is the purpose of a bird? What is a bird's purpose? And we can easily see, well, it's to make nests and get things and make other birds and fly. But we get really mixed up when we're talking about human beings because we think of ourselves as in this mysterious way, couldn't ever just put a purpose to it. And my Uncle James' purpose was simply to be useful and to make things. And that's what he did. And that pretty much, I mean, he had moods and things, from time to time, but he was just always being useful and making things in his shop. And I never knew him any other way. It was very hard for me to understand it, of course. And then I had to have my own struggle with believing my own thoughts and, counting on my own responses to them. And it was a disaster. And I had to go through that because I think it's all experiential, You don't learn how to water ski out of a book. You have to get wet.
You learn how not to water ski reading a book.
Yeah.
So that, the idea that we're contemplative, apparently, meaning we can think about our thinking. We can think about life. We can think about others. We can think about planning. We can make plans to do things that are much greater than we need, where the bird is basically just doing what it needs. And when it fulfills that need, it serves all the birds and all the people, because the birds are providing a function by eating seeds and traveling around and shitting those seeds and turning those fields into trees that wouldn't have otherwise been there without their distribution effort. They're not thinking about it. They're just doing it. They know naturally what to do. But my suspicion is that this thinking about, I was watching a guy, I was going over to a new restaurant in Venice, and I was going over there and helping them open up in the morning because there was a bunch of young kids and they were doing a great job and their coffee was great. So I'd go and sit and help them get set up in the morning. And I'm going over there and I heard this guy talking to himself. And he was talking loud. And I thought, two things occurred to me. I thought, he's really sick. And I said, I also realized that nobody who's ever talking to themselves out loud is ever happy with the self they're talking to. They always seem to be yelling. But I thought immediately, because I'd been kind of exploring this whole concept, who's sick? He's talking out loud about the self he thinks he am, and I'm keeping the thought to myself about what's wrong with him. I said, I'm now thinking about myself in relation to his self, and thinking he's crazy and not noticing that thinking about myself is actually thinking about my thinking. And I have interpreted that thinking about thinking itself has become myself, and as a result, been stuck in this mental maze of trying to get out of a cycle. I continue to insist on persisting, or continue to insist on resisting, which creates the resistance I claim is happening to me, rather than the simple effect of what I'm doing by my own insistence. And it was a little mind bending, because then I realized, I started listening to the way people talk about ego. We all tend to think of it as this thing that happens, that's some silly part of us that does these flagrant things that we just can't understand, but seems to get the best of us. My ego got the best of me. And how could I be so clear about the best of me being the best, and then think some illusory concept within my thinking could even get the best of any of it and take any of it, if I didn't think it was real? If I wasn't really sitting there imagining that this thing I'd created, I'm really trying to be God and wondering why God doesn't answer my prayers. When in fact, if there's anything infinite, it's already been answered. We've already got it all. We've been given everything. And it wasn't a gift that we didn't once had, because it wouldn't be a time-bound thing. It would be something that's ever present, meaning it's always now for humans. And that capacity you're talking about, your uncle, that usefulness, is exactly what the book says about what happens when we get sober. We become usefully whole. Why? Because we're integrated now. And integrity is not about trying to pretend I'm honest when I'm lying, but starting to notice that I have integrated parts that are naturally, comprehensively acting in my favor to fulfill my human capacity to provide more than I need, to produce more than I need, so I have more to provide. Not by being excessive in my demands and needs and stealing and all that, and then saying, now I've got a lot I can offer, but acting in a way that's so beneficial, people see it as an example they can easily follow, because it's the nature of all of our nature. The ultimate self would be the same self we all have. It's a knowing, absolute nature. So I think there have been people through history that operated on that basis, like you're talking about your uncle, and didn't even think that there was any self to think about, because they were busy. My sense is obsession is being obsessed with sick activities, but inspiration is being so fulfilled that there isn't anything other than that. And you can't be sick being inspired. you just can't do sick things when you're inspired, because it's effectively the wisdom of intuition. Literally, this natural, absolute, flowing nature of expressing reality that's always available, rather than trying to create it and think of it as something I do because it creates some exception, and then wonder why I feel so exceptional, is to be constantly feeling alone and apart from and discounted in some way. So I like your uncle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He was quite a compelling character. I think of the ego. I think Freud is just trying to name a phenomenon, really, in terms of his investigation as to what's going on in there,
Yeah.
But I always think of that, at least for me, when you go through and you start being confronted when you're trying to save your life and avail yourself of these people who have saved their lives, and where the wisdom in that is, and what do they do, is basically you're just doing what they're doing without a whole lot of thought. I mean, I tried to think my way out of it. I had a guy just said to me, listen, if you want somebody who can do these principles according to the way you think, then you should find that person, because I'm only giving you what was given to me. So, and presumably you thought that what I had was something you wanted, and you keep fighting it all the time. And so I would just suggest you to give up the fight and find somebody else, either to fight with, or somebody else that you can connect with, because I'm just handing you something that was handed to me, and so on. And he was great about identifying what we call the ego as the wanter, the voice, the part, the whatever you want to call it, that is not inherently good or bad. It just wants. And so it's the thing that gets you fed. It's the thing that gets you self-supporting. It's the thing that finds shelter when you're cold, because it wants that. The problem is it wants indiscriminately, and it's not interested in having because it's a wanting thing. So when you have it, it's very, very different. I remember wanting a 58 Studebaker really, really bad, a Lark 8. And I saved my money and I bought it. I paid $650 for it. It burned oil like a candle. And the minute I had it, it became a problem because it was no longer what I wanted, it was what I had. And having something,
Katie's making her weekly visit.
sweet, hi. Having something is completely different than wanting it because having it is yours to take care of. It is yours to deal with. In the case of the car, it was mine to keep fixing when the seals kept rotting and drying out because it wasn't used to the climate I was in. So I instantly wanted another car because wanting is always great because it's not here. Then it gets here and then you have it. It's a different thing. And that's what I think about the ego. Like I never wake up thinking, oh God, breakfast, I have to get breakfast again. But many, many times I'll wake up and think, I can't believe I have to sit on my cushion.
God forbid you do anything productive.
Yeah, because the breakfast thing slides in under my active mind, it's operating on another level. It's an instinctive kind of, keep this thing alive level. The other thing has got all this stuff going on, that it's funny.
Well, if it wasn't so sad, it would probably be funnier.
Well, as long as you don't bite down on it too hard, it is kind of amusing when you just watch it. It's when
Well,
you go down the road with it that it gets a little problematic, it seems to me.
when you begin to see that the imposter has always been a joke, it's very funny. When you take it seriously enough to imagine it's who you are and some component of you that's intractable, it's not
Yeah.
funny because we take it personally, thinking that's the person we're taking. We're actually making it. So I want to pose and challenge a couple of things to you. Within sobriety, we're often told to take contrary action, right?
Uh-huh.
We're also told to just follow. But no action ever occurs without a thought. There's no voluntary action we ever take that doesn't start with a thought. So the difference in the thinking we're doing when we start aligning with ideas of that people have actually begun to act on is principled thinking, which is the basis of real thinking, natural thinking, the actual purpose of thinking, not this contrived thinking about who I think I am and who I think I need to be, which I can never be. So the more I get, the more proof I have that it will never happen, and think that more and more and more and more is finally going to make it come true. So within the mental state, and people say, well, take contrary action. I say we wouldn't need to take contrary action if we weren't still thinking contrarily about our thinking. And the dismissing of thinking as being something that we shouldn't do at all, you were pointing out that intuition, when you're not thinking it, you don't have to think much at all. You don't have to have any hope for the most part, or faith or belief in reality when you start functioning on its basis, because it immediately confirms in its substantiveness and in its application that it's there and ready to interact because it never leaves. It's our own disconnected interaction with it that gives us those false senses about life being complicated and difficult, when it's the thoughts we're bringing to that relationship that are unsubstantiated and thought of as reality. Now, interesting about ego is that the original etymological basis of it is a capital I. It meant the essence of self, not the thinking about thinking itself as this false self originally. So we have taken not only the word and misused it, we've misused the thinking we're having as thinking about itself as being ourself, and then wondering why the more we think about it is never enough. Because if you dug a hole that was deep, you could fill it. But if the hole you dug is only imagined, you can't ever get enough dirt in it if there's no dirt being thrown into it. If it's all illusory, it's just a dream we're walking in this face of. 12 step says we've awakened spiritually, meaning we're no longer dreaming about spirit. We're starting to express it, starting to function on that basis. Practice principles in all of our affairs. That isn't another torture test like forever is that Bill's giving us. He's saying practice principles because that's the nature that's already here. It is the nature of nature. Start to operate on that nature, start to function on that nature, start to notice the wrong in our inability or unwillingness to adjust to that and correct wrongs rather than act right in the face of wrong. Start to actually see that we're at sea. We never know where the tides are going to be. We have some general idea, but the actuality of it, like the water skier, happens when you actually are at sea and you know what's going on. And if you're not adjusting according to what's happening because you're presuming that everything you were told that should happen is the only thing that should happen, that's how we tend to operate as a species, waiting for the thoughts to come true and make sure that everybody else follows our dictates as a result of that. So my sense is we've been thinking about thinking as reactive for so long that we think it's not, we think it's our nature. It's greedy, it's possessive, it's defensive, it's irritated, that isn't the thinking that we have. That's the thinking we produce. Coming to believe that our thinking is in fact reality, our thinking is in fact God, our thinking is in fact the sum total of all we're capable of when it is reactive in nature because it's a lie. It's based on something that has no basis at all. So if the thinking straightens out, the book says we straighten out mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. We're never out of sorts in an absolute nature. We're simply thinking about it incorrectly and feeling the consequences of that is disturbing, just as the book says. And misreading the cues we've been giving on our dashboard, the alarms and the bells and the whistles that are sirens that are going off, and thinking the job is to overcome them and feel better about them rather than say, oh, these are absolutely telling me exactly what I'm doing wrong, just like curriculum in a textbook. If you read it before you go to class, you have some idea of what the teacher's teaching. So my sense is that functional literacy that your uncle seemed to have naturally, because he wasn't thinking about himself, he was thinking about what he could do. He was thinking about producing.
Well, that's how I understood. I came to understand the phrase in the discipline that says we realize our problems are basically of our own making.
Exactly.
Was that why it's largely thought to be a thinking problem is that it doesn't mean that necessarily only that we're always fucking up because we, are invariably going to do that when we're out of sorts, but it has to be that the very nature of the problem eludes us, and we tend to see things as if, and it's a perspective thing as much as it's anything else to me, is we tend to see the world arrayed at us, and it's coming at us, and there's something we need to do to, if it's prohibiting us from doing something, or if we could just crack the code, it would help us get somewhere, or it would, as if it had to do with us. And that's,
well, and we're victims to it in that description.
Yeah. And the world is, the problem with it, essentially, to me, is that that's not true.
Exactly.
The world is not arrayed against me. The world is not working against me. It just is. There's no should, there's no shouldn't. It just is, and I try to perceive it as such, and I'm all the time making mistakes, but if you perceive the world as arrayed against you, you have already made yourself an unsolvable problem because it's not real. And so you're trying to come up with a solution to an imaginary problem, and there is no such thing. And so the solution is always eluding me because I'm thinking it's sort of like that whole thing about to a hammer, every problem is a nail. and so
Or a thumbnail.
yeah, but
No, you're right on it. You're absolutely on. I mean, think of the first step in relation to what you're saying. It wasn't alcohol, Bill says. It's a symbol and a symptom. What is it? An underlying disease. What's the powerlessness in the first step? I can control and enjoy my drinking. Long as I maintain that idea in any way, I tried to prove it by drinking out of control, thinking more and more drinking would prove I was in control. I literally had that in my mind. I could drink a quart of tequila and pull ligaments out of my back dancing as a result of that and not think I had a problem. Think the problem now was my back pain, not the consequence of that thinking at all, because I never questioned that it could possibly be me at the dead center of the cause.
yes.
What's the other part of that in the first step is that we can drink like normal people. If I'm
Well,
thinking a thought that's a lie, I'm never going to function on the basis of normality. And I'm also going to think the intoxication with that thought is so compelling that nothing else is happening. So it becomes seemingly my only reality. And I
well, I don't know.
actually
Yeah.
induce blindness.
I don't know about anybody else, but I never wanted to. I don't, first of all, I've never met a normal person. I don't even know what that is. But second of all, I mean, yeah, my brother doesn't drink like I did. My brother has a couple beers and he stops. Okay, whatever. But the idea that the one thing in the book that I've always sort of gone, nah, I'm not sure about that is when it says the obsession of every alcoholic is to drink like a normal person. I didn't want to drink like a normal person. If a normal person drinks like my brother, I wanted to drink the way I drank and not have any consequences.
Yeah.
And so the idea that
Think of the denial in that though, right?
it's yeah,
We could do something and suffer no effect. We could be a cause, but there's no effect in that whatsoever. And then the
yeah, it's
effect
like
becomes something so accidental that we don't want any, we say it's not happening. Can't possibly be happening because if I'm not the cause, there is no effect. It's happening to me. It's being caused by others.
yeah.
Completely flips the story, the script, backward. And Bill's talking always about a turnaround, meaning we're walking. Aristotle said we walk through life backward, only seeing what's happened, not what's next or what's happening. So if the thinking, and I agree with you on this normality, my sense is that humans have suffered, interestingly, the definition of self-consciousness that you would think would be a high point of contemplative capacity and a meditative state that would be so inclusive that it would be pondering the outskirts of the universe in all regards.
Can I
You know
interrupt
what
for a second?
You know what the definition is?
Well,
Undue regard for appearance. Think of that.
well, that goes back to every single origin story, a primitive origin story about the creation of the world and creation of human beings,
Exactly.
except Christianity, which is editorialized after the original story, which is basically human consciousness was in all the origin stories is when we
Contaminated.
were aware that we were separate from our creation.
Right. Which,
We're
by the
separate.
way, if it's infinite, is impossible to be separate from.
Right. And so this gets said, oh, this is when it's trying to explain human consciousness, the difference between a human being and say a cow. Is a cow is not, for all we know about cows, and I've had cows and I observe them, they don't tend to be thinking about the past, nor are they projecting very far into the future. And in fact, if there's any danger, if a coyote gets in the field, they will bunch up together and move away from it until they perceive that the threat is gone, and then they just go back to doing what they're doing. They don't look over their shoulder going, that fucking coyote really screwed with our formation here. They don't seem to have a resentment piece, or they don't, which means they're not referencing the past the way that human beings do.
Well, they're also not fearing things that aren't happening. And our experience has us fearing something that isn't happening as being all that's happening. An ego, a sense of ego, means that my life depends on maintaining a lie. That completely disavows any capacity I have to operate on a basis that's aligned with life's nature. So what do I start doing? Dysfunctioning, and feel all of those things are true because I've made choices now to operate on a basis to prove the wrong is right. And my life becomes an example of that wrongness. Mark, I know you were trying to say something there, so I don't want to.
No, it wasn't really that important. It was just that when you guys were talking so much about the not having the effect from the cause, it really, I was thinking a lot about what you were talking about in the past about not wanting to exist or not existing.
Exactly. It's a suicidal thought, which all addiction is, to think we have nothing to do with something. Saying that we have nothing to do with the effect and we're victims of it is to say we're not the cause. What is that? It's to claim irresponsibility. If responsibility is a principle that we all have inherently with our existence, there is no irresponsibility but in thought. And to have that thought as being irresponsible is the only thing I can do responsibly, is to turn my instincts to survive in backward and start functioning on a level that's actually killing my body and others in the name of thinking it's the only thing I can do. And collectively as a species, we've done that better than any other species that I can think of. I don't know of any species that has caused so much threat that they have actually become their own threat and used other countries and other people and other things as an excuse for that threat, rather than the collective nature of this kind of thinking that we've been doing as long as humans have been struggling with one another and thinking that their right justified killing others because they were wrong. So you're right. It's that was the point earlier being, we talk about low self-esteem. There is no self-esteem in something that's an illusion thought to be reality. It's a delusion. That's insanity to think that there's esteem in it, or that there's a self I need to protect and save because my life is threatened. My sense is we're not afraid of death, we're afraid of living. Because to actually live would dispel every rumor we thought of who we were and kill off that absolute thing that doesn't even exist. Doesn't exist right now any more than I think of it as being real. And that's a major upset in the function of being able to express, to align with the law and order of nature. And it's no coincidence that they call things that are out of order disorders. Anxious disorders, metabolic disorders, nervous disorders, mental disorders. The thinking has been backward so long, we think it's normal and it's human nature to be greedy and lazy and hateful and spiteful and wanting more and more and more and never getting enough. That is not normal. That's insanity acting in ways that completely counter our ability to be productive and have more to give based on that inspiration that is absolutely the nature of this intuitive, wise, all-knowing whatever it is. I don't even know how to describe it without floundering. But if it's absolute, that's a great word to suggest. How could the absolute not be absolute and still be absolute? It would completely defy the whole nature of reason and logic and words to start thinking that words don't have any meaning whatsoever. We give them that meaning, but they're references to an essence of something that is probably incomprehensible. And to begin to concede that is to begin to have it, as you were talking about, Arliss. When I don't have what I have naturally, I think I have to have something else. So I get into that cycle. All of that stuff comes out of a thought that I am not absolute in nature, that I am not connected to the absolute essence of nature. As soon as I have that thought, I think it's up to me to get there and to find it. And I can never seem to find it. And I can never seem to get there. And I always feel out of place and disconnected and I don't belong. And everybody else is wrong. And everybody else is attacking me. And it's everybody else's problem and not mine. And I'm isolated. And I get further and further alone because any contest to my thought becomes a risk to my life. None of it's true. It's insanity is reality. It's not a good start. And the freedom of the moment is that we're always free to choose or re-choose. There's nothing we've done long enough historically as human beings or individually as human beings that has gone on so long to prevent us from re-choosing now. An absolute recognition that all that's possible is possible. And that includes all the things I think are impossible that are impossible. And also starting to see that what's really impossible is ever turning a lie into truth. It's not going to happen. The fairy tale is never going to come true. And we have history littered with fairy tales, talking about a time and time that it will all come together, sometime in the future that never seems to come. As we get more despotic and more conflicted and more hateful and spiteful and contemptful and develop more and more elevated rational ways that are completely irrational, logical, and preposterous, and make believe it's the only thing we can do, and nobody's ever going to change. We can talk for everybody by thinking of nobody as ever being able to change, and yet forget that it's only up to each of us, as you were describing, Arliss. Each of us has that freedom. Each of us makes that choice. And when your sponsor said to you, or that man said, you don't want to listen to me, go listen to somebody else. That's actually warranting the honor that we have for the individual to be able to stand up when they choose to stand up and when they choose to see. We're actually giving people that opportunity by saying, I can't do it for you. It's not up to me to do it. I can offer you what I have. If you don't want it, don't take it. Go find what you think you want, please. There's an honor in that. And it's not enabling people in the worst way. It's enabling them to begin to fulfill the capacity they've always had by seeing it's the single decision they make that makes the difference between that forward progress into an eyes open experience of reality and life as it is, rather than this idea that as long as I keep my eyes shut, reality is only what I think of it. Even our eyes can't see themselves. We have all kinds of metaphors to see that this thinking about our thinking seems to be very difficult, but we know better, or we would not suffer, we would not feel conflicted, we would not feel emotional turmoil, we would not feel depressed, we would not feel less than if we didn't know there was something absolutely greater. Wouldn't occur to us. We'd be a bird flying around, building nests and shitting and not knowing all the net effects, but performing our function perfectly without doubt, depression, or hesitation. You know, when it comes to cows, I saw something once because I was reading something about the vegan and the vegetarian conversation about meat and the adrenaline that is pumped into the veins. And when they're in those chutes going to get shot in the head with that, they start knowing something's wrong, but there's nowhere they can do because they narrow those chutes down and get them in a stampede almost of movement. And they have a sense something's not right. You can see that they're looking and there seems to be a panic and all that stuff. I could be wrong about that, but they say that if in the Hebrew tradition of kosher killing, there's a different approach to the killing so that the meat isn't infused with the adrenaline and all the toxins that are released by the emergency that end up being in the meat. They end up being eaten. And in our experience, all of those drugs, the chemical experience we're creating by making believe that no substance in a thought is substantive, sets our body off in an emergency and releases all kinds of drugs that are being used for an imagined emergency that would be very helpful for us on a daily basis to maintain. So we have all sorts of natural bodily chemicals being overused and depleted, and adrenaline being used as a new drug to feel the excitement of being in charge and all that stuff, but it now isn't available when I actually have an emergency. So I can't respond adequately or as adequately to an actual emergency, which I'm designed to look at accurately and immediately and not think about, but act in an intuitive manner, meaning I don't have to think much to know what to do. Thinking is very different than knowing. Thinking is a process, knowing is an absolute state. To see it that way, think of it. Intuition starts making sense. Intuition is defined as knowledge beyond reason, meaning there's no reason, thinking, or understanding in it. And my suspicion is thinking is designed to follow that lead so that the kind of thinking we do that we call thinking, which is this obvious repetitious process of voices going on in our heads, each one of those voices probably representing some lie we're trying to make believe is true. So we give it a voice and a body as though it exists. We start to create a narrative and a story and a play about it. We've got some theatrical performance going on that's extremely dramatic, and we wonder why we feel so serious about everything. And unimpressible, numb, desensitized. Desensitization for humans is not healthy. Our sensitivity is, in fact, awareness. Our hypersensitivity is awareness. It's great awareness. And numbness is always an indication of pain and something wrong. So the idea that it isn't there because we go numb to it and desensitize ourselves is just another lie in the name of thinking we got it, we're controlling it. She's back. Second performance today.
I also really like Arliss's talking about having, or
Yeah.
the want, and the compared to the have, and I really related with that. And as far as like my fears are always either one of the two, of the want of not getting mine, or once I get it, I have the fear of losing it. So it's that really spoke to me a lot, and I was able to relate with that. And as a human, can I have that? Do I have the ability to have that, like the cow, like that didn't have the resentment or whatever, just doesn't have that fear? Like, do humans do humans have a point where they don't have that fear, and I just don't have that?
Well, I would say that we've been thinking about consciousness only in terms of thinking about thinking so long that the thing we find when we're meditating and always find when we look for it is always there, because it is the knowing nature that we all share that we don't talk about, because it isn't something that gives each of us the credit we're looking for when we claim not to have it. And the whole having thing, I mean, we're designed to have wants. We want to breathe. We want to be healthy. We want to survive. We want to procreate. We want to expand. We want to grow. We want to develop. The survival instinct is about health. It's not about disease. And as that I forget the doctor's name, Dr. Bush, who talked about the cancer cell only wanting to replicate another cancer cell to create a neighborhood where it feels it's welcome. It's the same thing with the thinking.
Yeah, that was like this morning when I realized how healthy my body was when it was doing what it was supposed to be doing.
Yeah. You know
Bill
what
says, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a really good way of posing the question. The problem of being a human being, just the way we are made. The Dalai Lama was asked recently what he's been doing, what he's been up to. And he said he meditates 7 times a day on his death. And he said, I want to be with my last breath, exhaling human kindness, loving kindness. And I'm not certain that I would have the ability to do that were I not examining the nature of my life through the possibility of my death in terms of my meditation. So I don't know what he is actually doing when he's meditating on his own death, but I figure if the Dalai Lama is looking downrange at something he'd like to do and doesn't feel like he'll be able to do it, then what am I worried about in terms of whether or not I'm doing it right or wrong or whatever? He's looking at something. I think what he's articulating is what the Buddha said is, very simply, life is a problem. And it doesn't mean that it's, oh my God, here it comes. It's something to look at and work. We work our way through our life. We come up against things. And I think what the problem with being a human is that, and I say this from watching my Uncle James, he literally did not think about, he was a really good carpenter. So he would apply his thinking, he said, to the problem of building some shelves. So I've got to miter this joint. So what should be the angle? What should be the particular angle depending on what exactly that I'm doing? Because they weren't always square, because he had some really wild looking shelves that were built on an axis. And so he was always figuring things out, relative to cutting it and putting it together. He said when he leaves the shop, I stop thinking. And I think it was a way he's describing that he's not interested in creating more work for the brain. Now, my experience of me is I don't even know how much work I'm creating the way that I'll think about things. I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you and I'm already looking, there's 4 or 5 things I want to do before the sun comes down out here, because when the sun comes down out here, it's going to be about 3 degrees outside. So I want to be able to do these things while the sun's still up. As I'm talking, I'm going, I've got to get off in about 6 minutes because I have a commitment before I get to that stuff. And I can already feel the anxiety in my body, right? As I'm saying it to you. When I breathe and go, well, I'm just a guy, I feel better. I don't know what that is. Just doing
But
that.
think of the anxiety though, Arliss, as being a bodily language speaking to you about thoughts you're having in relation to what's happening that aren't actually true, but they're choices you've made. And it isn't to say don't not make them. And I think that Buddha said attachment in life is suffering and a problem. I don't think he said life is a problem. I think he said it's the attachment. And I think he was talking about this addiction.
Well, he actually does say life is a problem. I think what he's talking about is what you're talking about.
Yes, yes.
Our experience of life, the minute we wake up, our brain starts going, which is why all these guys get down on the cushion. I mean, if our default position was mindfulness, we would be talking about something else in these traditions. If our natural state was mindful presence, but every one of these guys that I listen to, all the Rinpoches, all the big meditators, they all say we are essentially acknowledging that our brain thinks. That's what it does.
Yeah.
So we can watch it do that, and we can selectively apply that, and we can create longer stretches where we are mindful. Peter Matheson said this thing. He was on the cushion for 28 years, and he said he had this experience of total presence. And it came over him, and it seemed like it was a lifetime of presence as he sat there.
No time.
And when it was gone, his first thought was, oh shit, I've got to get that back.
Exactly.
So I would suggest that that the way we're made to say that we could transcend our essentialness as humans is the thing that gets us in trouble. It really gets us in trouble. It's to me, I don't know, and this is a language thing, but I think, Mark, when you said that thing, it always makes me feel comfortable, because I sometimes literally forget that I'm human, or that I think I'm supposed to be some other way, or that something's wrong with me, and it's always my brain just going off down an alley or up a thing. There's no essential wrongness or essential, it's this very difficult thing to shake, which I think is the ultimate addiction, is addiction to my own thoughts.
Yes. So to that point, Arliss, it could also be that our nature is all of those things that don't seem to be our nature, because we've been so chronically affected by our thinking in an addictive manner that we believe it's true and it is reality. It includes what Buddha talked about as an addiction. Bill Wilson nailed it when he said the disease is centered in the mind, and he's really talking about the brain as the thinker. It's not the mind and the abs. You all right?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I was on mute.
It's not the mind in the mind to the human is the brain, but the mind in the essence of that knowing nature would be the nature of nature and the essence of it, like Einstein was talking about. it's somewhat preposterous to me that we have presumed that that nature would create us defectively so that we then had to struggle interminably and not see it as something we're doing in our own choices. And was it Peter Mathiasson you were talking about?
Peter Matheson, yeah,
Peter Matheson.
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew his name, but I haven't read him. But think of the fact that immediately when he had that thought, how do I hang on to it? He immediately had the experience that it was no longer there.
Yes.
Because in relation to experiencing it, he immediately thought, like historically, he had to get back to the thinking about it, which immediately gave him an impression it wasn't there. Now, if the impression is false, and we're all having that impression now, then we're creating new false impressions to make believe that we need to keep getting there and looking for it rather than say it's here now, regardless of what I think, no matter how I think. And it's not only here for me, it's here for everybody, everywhere. I had a dream. I always wanted to meet the Dalai Lama because I wanted to pose some of this to his extraordinary experience, given that he was taken as a child and ended up subjected to something that he questions whether he wanted to even face. So this is a difficult life that he seemed to be chosen somehow. But I had this dream of being at a urinal and he comes into the bathroom and I started singing Hello Dolly to him.
That's a good dream.
like such a preposterous combination and confluence of bringing some humor to something so human as peeing. Just that always to me gives me relief. No matter what's going on, if I can go and have to go, I always feel like, wow, this is actually, whoever invented this knew what they were doing.
Well, I was on an airplane with him one time. They brought him on after everybody got sat down. They put him in the seat. He was up a seat, 2 seats ahead of me to my left. I could just see the side of his face. The stewardess comes up and said, "May I get you some orange juice?" And he looked up at her, and I couldn't see the full of his face. I could just see the side of it, but I could see her face. And he looked up at her and he said, "Yes." And she was completely stunned. She couldn't move. And it was, I thought, well, whatever's going on here, this dude's is plugged into something. But the other part of it was that he's incredibly present.
Yes.
Everyone that has anything to do with him says that they feel as if they're the only person in the room with him, or that time stops, or it slows down, or whatever. Now, I've made these jokes about it that, well, if that's your business, you're probably going to be better at it than somebody who's just doing it for a hobby, but what I mean to say is I think he has accepted, and I go back to what Mark posed, he's accepted what it is to be a human being. And it isn't to try to be something other than a human being. It's to live within the scope of being a human being, which is kind of an astonishing thing when you think about it. I mean, that we can actually have the power by thinking to make ourselves ill. We have the power by thinking, to make these beautiful things like bridges and space travel, and depending on your point of view about technology, the gigabyte. But I think that the best I've been able to do growing up and getting older is to stop trying to be something else. To just accept that my mind does these things. And the more I accept it, the more room comes in, like I relax. Oh, you're just a little nuts today, bud. That's all. You're just a little nuts. And,
I would propose, given that we're coming to the end of the typical time we take, that even while you're not thinking those things still exist. And if you think we think about being human as exclusive from the being part of it that we've added secondarily. And human being is actually contrary and ironic and a paradox in its own term. So we're physical in one respect and beings in another respect, and beings don't come and go because they're not a spatially bound essence. They're absolutely absolute. And humans seem to be bound by space and further bound by the concepts we make believe are true as though they're true, and then end up as in a cycle of thinking we need to unconstruct what we insist on continuing to construct within the thinking. And the fact is that ever-present nature, if it is ever present, and if it's always there when we look, there's a pretty good chance it's always there, period. And it's only thinking it isn't there that sets us off on this idea that I have to work harder to be human rather than see that I already know I'm human, or I wouldn't be watching the thoughts I'm having and even notice that something's wrong. I couldn't do it. I would be in it. And the idea that they're real has me think I'm inside the thinking and can't get in it. And people say I'm stuck in my head and it's my brain operate all things as though we have nothing to do with it, rather than see we're actually choosing it. We're choosing the experience because we want it to support the contention that we're separate, we're apart, we're alone, and that the thinking we're doing is in fact reality. Once I start down that path, it's a fractured state of all sorts of peril and misery. And Bill also said in relation to what you said earlier about we think our problem is of our own making, he said, avoid the deliberate manufacture of misery. Because misery is always deliberately manufactured because it's not a natural aspect of life. It's an aspect about thinking about life as life is not rather than as life is. And that's not an alignment, that would be a malignment of thinking. So I pose this because I want to challenge in the conversation to say, maybe if we've had the thinking backward and think we have to keep getting there, we're once again putting thinking in the position of actually beginning to, if thinking can offset reality, then thinking is more powerful than reality. And basically that defines the spiritual malady, is the idea that spirit is only there when I think it is, and it isn't there when I don't think it is. That gives thinking more powerful than that spirituality. We're free to do that, but we're also free to suffer the consequences that come with that and make believe that there's something happening to us rather than being caused by us. And I would say that that's a fairly good idea. If I think I'm irresponsible for something, the next thing I think is that there's nothing I can do about it. The next thing I think is it's the only thing I can do. And I'm off on another addictive tangent that I've started and want to think that stopping it is the answer when I'm actually looking at the effect rather than saying, well, if I'm the cause, how insane would it be of me to continue to do this and make believe all the time that it's the symptom I need to treat rather than simply say, I have no obligation to continue this whatsoever. Speaks to 84 and 85, taken to a place of neutrality, as though it was always there. He spells it out. I love talking about this because my suspicion is that the discussion isn't held widely enough to begin to see that when a thought changes in a group, the group changes dramatically. And there's an awareness shift that changes, and that knowing nature becomes more obvious because it's seen as it is, which is a function of all things, all that are and all that is, rather than something that's limited to some of us who happen to, that woman being stunned had to know what she was looking at to be stunned by it, right? She wouldn't know what would the relationship to it be if she had no awareness of it.
Right.
And my sense is we're so fractured in our mentality that we speak in terms that reinforce the idea of separateness and reinforce the old stories rather than start to see that there's no story in the present, because if everything's happening, what is left to be told? It's an absolute state of present awareness that we're always in. We're always in a contemplative, meditative state. We are simply obstructing it with things to continue to support the contention of the things we think we're not even thinking, the deeper belief systems, the deeper systems of culture, the things we presume to be real that aren't real at all. They're simply thoughts operating that way. I know in my experience, I started to see the subconscious as the place that I keep every bit of irresponsibility I'm ashamed for and don't want anybody to see. So I pretend I have nothing to do with it. That's not me. I don't think that. Well, if we're talking about it and thinking about it, we must all be thinking about it to be talking about it.
Arliss, I'm picking up your nervousness.
What?
I'm picking up
Oh,
your nervousness on the time.
I got to take a leak.
Oh.
So
The ultimate
thanks,
relief.
Mark. Mark, I really appreciate that for you alerting me to this fact that I have to take a leak.
Mark made his mark.
And I will I'll see you guys at some point.
I
Good to
appreciate
see you.
Carlos.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Good to be,
Thank you, guys.
good to be with
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Harry, very much. It's good to see your name up in lights.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You got it. Mark, that
Yeah.
was good. Thank you. Thank you very much for that quote. I mean, it was perfect, and I like the engagement at that level because it suggests the broadness of our ability to begin to influence and interact, which really replicates the fact that we're all influencing and interacting, even when we want to make believe that we have nothing to do with what's happening.
Yes. And the quote would have been not much without your question of how is my body today?
Yeah,
So thank you.
you got it. Love you.
Love you guys.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Be well.
Thanks.